This is Examine Sport, a podcast of the sports ethicist. I am your host, Sean Klein. Each episode of Examine Sport focuses on a paper in the philosophy of sport literature. We look at classic discipline-defining articles, exciting newly published works, and dig deep for important but not as well-known papers. You can subscribe, comment, and find an archive of all shows, along with links and related information at sportsethicist.com. In this episode of Examine Sport, I examine Robert Simon's article, The Ethics of Strategic Fouls, a reply to Fraleigh, published in the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport in 2005. In this article, Simon provides a limited defense of strategic fouls based on his theory of broad internalism. Now, the question of strategic fouls is an interesting one. In some ways, it is prosaic. How should we evaluate this common strategy in games? But in attempting to answer this seemingly simple question, we have to bring to bear and articulate our view of the nature of sport, the role of rules, and how these are applied and interpreted. It raises important questions about morality and the status quo, the dynamic between how things are done and how they ought to be done. Now, in this debate between Warren Fraleigh and Robert Simon, the theories of formalism, conventionalism, and broad internalism are made more explicit and clearer by examining how these theories work in the case of strategic fouls. Now, Fraleigh was a longtime critic of the strategic foul. His Why the Good Foul is Not Good was published in 1982, and, by the way, is the subject of Episode 4 of Examine Sport. Now, Fraleigh's argument in that earlier article was a more straightforward formalist account. The formal rules of the game prohibit certain actions and provide penalties for such actions. Therefore, since these are prohibited actions, it is wrong to engage in these actions for competitive gain. Strategic fouls, by definition, are violation of the rules, and since rule violations render the game itself a failure, an intentional foul can't be good. Now, in a more recent article, Intentional Rule Violations, One More Time, published in 2003, this is the one to which Simon is responding, Fraleigh still largely rejects strategic fouls, but does so on the grounds that are much closer to broad internalism than his earlier formalism. In his updated argument, Fraleigh appeals to the distinction between constitutive and restorative skills. Now, constitutive skills are the skills that are central to the test of sport. These skills and their tests defined constitute the sport. These are things like dribbling and shooting in basketball, or throwing and catching in the NFL, goalkeeping in soccer, hockey, lacrosse, and so on. Now, restorative skills are the skills connected with restarting or restoring the game after a stoppage, usually due to a rule violation. These are things like free kicks and free throws, penalty shots, and penalty kicks. Now, Fraleigh's newer argument is fairly straightforward. First, sport should be based on and evaluated according to the constitutive skills that comprise our understanding, our interpretation of the central test of the game. Restorative skills are, by definition, derivative and secondary to constitutive skills. So allowing or encouraging the use of fouls as strategic tools in a game confuses restorative skills with constitutive skills. And this confusion undermines the central true test of the game. Thus, Fraleigh concludes, quote, "The ideal must still be to minimize the number of accepted rule violations," end quote. So the thrust of Fraleigh's argument is still formalist. These are actions prohibited by the rules, so they shouldn't be used as a competitive advantage. But by resting his argument on the idea of the central tests of the game and the roles of the different kinds of skills of a game, Fraleigh's argument is a more broadly internalist argument. He's appealing not just to the rules, but to the best version of the game and the underlying internal principles that make the most sense of the rules. Now, Simon is quite sympathetic to Fraleigh's argument. He says the arguments are, quote, "quite plausible," end quote. But he wants to push back a bit. Simon argues that there is still something to say in defense of what he calls the judicious use of strategic fouls. Now, the first challenge Simon mounts is against Fraleigh's presentation of the restorative skills. There are, according to Simon, two ways to understand restorative skills. The first is their functional aspect. These skills serve a particular function in sport. Quote, their role is to put the game back on track after certain sorts of violations of constitutive rules, end quote. Now, the second aspect is their justificatory aspect. This is the claim that since restorative skills are less interesting and less complex than constitutive skills, their secondary or derivative status is justified. Now, Simon grants the functional aspect of the restorative skills, but he argues that the justificatory aspect fails. Quote, the second condition, the justificatory one, does not provide an overarching justification for always regarding the exercise of restorative skills as inferior to the exercise of constitutive ones, end quote. So, some constitutive skills are themselves not that interesting or complex. Simon's example is, dribbling out the clock, right, instead of engaging in more interesting action. But more substantially, Simon points to things like penalty killing in ice hockey that are no less complex or interesting than the skills involved in full strength play. The psychological and strategic complexity of foul shots in basketball or penalty shots in soccer can create strategic complexities in these games. These examples show, according to Simon, that the idea that restorative skills are necessarily less complex or less interesting is not correct. The use of strategic fouls and the restorative skills in games might actually, quote, add to rather than undermine the interest, strategic complexity, and the excitement of a contest, end quote. Now, that may be so, and might be inevitable in games, but there's still a question about its moral appropriateness. Intentionally violating the rules for an advantage might make games more interesting, but it still stands in need of a moral defense. To provide this moral defense, Simon first starts by categorizing different kinds of strategic fouls, and there are several different kinds of strategic fouls, and our evaluation of these fouls has to reflect the differences between these. First, we have the case of strategic fouls that are presumptively unethical. These are fouls that really do seem to undermine the main central tests of the game. The first grouping of these presumptively unethical fouls are, quote, where a less skilled team or player resorts to strategic fouls in order to disrupt the style or eliminate the advantage of skills of a superior team, end quote. Simon's example of this is a hockey team that is far less skilled at skating and uses prohibited roughhousing to interfere with the skilled skating of the other side. Knowing they'd lose if they had to play within the rules, they intentionally violate the rules to increase their chances. This seems to go against the core tests and understanding of what the game is about. The second category is where the foul is meant to, quote, deprive an opponent of an advantage already gained through superior use of constitutive skills, end quote. An example of this would be tripping or otherwise illegally preventing a player from scoring on a breakaway in games like basketball or soccer or hockey. These are presumptively wrong because they violate, quote, the principle that sport contests should be primarily tests of constitutive skills. Either the constitutive skills in these cases are prevented or canceled by the use of illegal or prohibited play, and this violates the core principle of what games should be about. But not all fouls fall into this category. We have fouls that occur because players are playing hard and aggressively. Quote, mixed strategic fouls occur when athletes play more aggressively at key points in the contest, knowingly taking on the increased risk of fouling, end quote. Such fouls are still partly intentional because when we play this way, we know that there is an increased risk of committing fouls and we choose to play that way anyway. Nevertheless, the main intention is to play aggressively, not to foul. For this reason, they do not fall into the presumptively unethical category. The game is better for all parties when we allow for, even encourage, aggressive playing, even at the cost of increased fouls. Now, Simon now moves on to the case of judicious strategic fouls, those fouls that are ethically justified. Simon presents 4 conditions that must each hold for strategic fouls to be ethically justified. First, opponents are roughly equally matched in constitutive skills. This is demonstrated by a close game or even wins and losses over a period of a season between the two teams, and this is the deciding game. This also shows that the restorative skills aren't replacing constitutive skills. Both sides of the contest are engaging in the test of constitutive skills because we see that they are equally matched in those skills. Now, second condition is that no alternative strategy of constitutive skills for reasonable chance at winning. There's no other realistic or reasonable option to get possession back or to stop the clock or to get some opportunity to score. The foul at this point adds to the complexity and the interest of the game because it prevents a team from just running out the clock. Third, the penalty for the foul is seen as a reasonable price to pay and as a reasonable compensation to the team fouled. So the foul is committed knowing the price to be paid for it, and the team fouled is fine with being fouled. They're not made really worse off. You can imagine them saying, we'll take those free throws, or we'll take that free kick. Thank you very much. Fourth, the foul doesn't take away an advantage earned by constitutive skills. This rules out things like tripping or preventing an obvious goal-scoring opportunity. Now, the basis for these conditions, argues Simon, is broad internalism. Now, for more detail on broad internalism, I'd suggest the previous Examine Sport episode on Simon's internalism and internal values in sport. Now, in the article being examined here, Simon doesn't go into great detail on the theory, but it does tell us that when evaluating practices in sport, broad internalism tells us to look at, in addition, quote, in addition to the rules, a broad interpretation of the best understanding of the game, including respect for its internal norms and values. What he means is that while we must take into account the rules, we have to understand and interpret those rules in a way that presupposes internal principles and norms about what the game is about. And we appeal to the best understanding or interpretation of what the game is about in order to understand how to apply and interpret the rules of the game. And this guides our assessment of any given practice in a game. Does it fit with that understanding of the game? Does it add to and improve the game understood this way? In terms of fouls, then we have to ask, is the game better in its best interpretation by having some kinds of fouls? Now, Simon argues that the answer here is yes. Now, it's not simply a yes, but Simon concludes that there are some kinds of fouls that make the game better in terms of its internal understanding of what the game is about, and so such fouls are justified. The 4 conditions he presents are ways of testing this, of seeing if the foul fits with our best interpretation of the game. The first and fourth condition test to make sure that the fouls do not replace, but instead add to the central test of the game. The second condition tests that the fouls make the game more strategically complex and competitively intense, not less so. And the third condition tests that the fouls are options with a price, not punishments for acting wrongly. So if Simon is correct, he shows that while many intentional fouls might be unethical, not all are. Broad internalism shows us that there are some strategic fouls that are morally appropriate. Thank you for listening to Examine Sport. You can subscribe, comment, and find an archive of all shows, along with links and related information at sportsethicist.com. Please also consider rating the show at Apple Podcasts, liking it on YouTube, and sharing on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere. You can email the show, sportsethicist@gmail.com.